I'm looking at the mediated image from the perspective of two artists, Emilio Vedova and Christopher Wall. There is a very, very different contextual language and a very different sort of appropriation of painterly methodologies within both practices. However, there is a very uncanny, aesthetic, almost visual relationship between the two, which became really important in relationship to how I was thinking through painterly production and painterly image. Vedova almost represents the sort of, the last paradigm of modernism, whereby the ideology of the sort of subjective expression is still very much at the forefront of his thinking about what it means to make a painting. He's very revolutionary in his approach, if you like. He really is very physical still in relationship to how his paintings get produced. Not only is it physical, but within that sort of physicality, almost there is an ideology of, if you like, a kind of humanitarian, almost like a universal sort of understanding of the self in relationship to the world. Christopher Wall completely dismantles that by literally appropriating very different means of work production and image production. So in some ways, Wall almost represents this kind of completely kind of postmodern entrance and a sort of postmodern kind of thinking about the image production and the value through simple application of printing techniques, of actually almost reducing and kind of editing out, deleting the content of the painterly gesture through replication and seriality. But, I mean, the visual relationship between the two becomes very interesting to my own practice as well, in terms of almost how I am appropriating, which I'll probably show images later, how I'm appropriating this idea of a gesture that is very much transferred, deleted out in relationship to a very direct and a kind of very physical, material approach to painting. So it already sort of I'm kind of beginning to think in terms of fragmentation of a pictorial surface as a sort of almost like something that becomes part of a language, a sign, a reference, but also a physicality and performality. And maybe what I'm sort of, kind of getting at is that how the two, instead of being in a separate dualism, sort of dual camps, can actually become part of the one working methodology and practice. Some of the examples I'm actually using in this in the chapter as well are, for instance, Wade Guyton, Stephen Preen, and Jutta Kother, because it almost like kind of charts the sort of the idea of the whole shift in the paradigm of the image production and value, whereby the information technology has gone so far into its own mediality that the gesture is now, so this ghostly representation of the medium itself, rather than a sort of, if you like, a modernist kind of representation of one's subjectivity and expression. So it's almost this idea, that fight within my own practice, that fight between the expression and that fight between the communication, a language as actually that's become almost like insufficient in relationship to the kind of society we live in, referring to the internet technology, referring to the social sites, referring to the sort of almost kind of, the interruptions we are now finding within, kind of the reality, if you like, that's actually virtual almost. Well, it is virtual in a relationship of how the language actually almost becomes insufficient, as he almost doesn't have time to think through words, to think through body any longer. So it's kind of trying to find the relationship between the two within a painting itself. And then third chapter, the communities, takes on board pretty much the sense of subjectivity, expressivity, looking at the kind of almost the more like rebellious art movements, such as abstract expressionism and Cobra movement and situationist as well, is almost like proposition towards a radical kind of shift in painterly production that, you know, felt almost that the sort of latter part of the modernism actually shot down as something that was sort of almost too kind of expressive, too close to the excesses of the body. And I deliberately returned to that in relationship to almost a formation of a thought within a painting as something that consists of all these communities of references, that doesn't actually necessarily try to make sense or kind of make friendship within those very different formal as well as sort of material kind of incisions within a pictorial space, but almost take them on board as a representation of the one that's premised on a multiplicity of references and a multiplicities of timelines that perhaps can form painterly image. And toward the end, I've had an opportunity outside the actual printing of the books to actually, you know, put an exhibition together at the Cass Gallery last February, and that was titled "What Will the Community Think?" That was almost taken on board as a kind of a thinking process again, and a selection of images that were produced over the last three years, and almost a combination of three bodies of work. They were sort of working towards this idea, or sort of working towards a sort of communitarian, almost dialogue-based approach to painting. Again, it refers to the vocabulary, the kind of vocabulary we have created through, you know, sort of mediated gesture as well as sort of very expressive gesture and very sort of direct gesture, and almost the kind of the printed on gesture. What becomes really important in my own practice is the sort of the confidence almost to be able to combine something that what perhaps in theory does not come close together, in practice visually can hold water. So these images, almost the paintings, kind of become part of not just a dialogue of what research it's kind of undergone and what the theories are kind of highlighted, but also becomes a sort of a time scale, a sort of charting of the 3 years, working and thinking through, but doesn't necessarily answer the question of how it is to make a painting in relationship to all the conditions pre-mapped by the kind of historical references and the contemporary sort of political and social circumstances, but almost kind of keeps it very experimental on a level of kind of what does it make to actually create an image in relationship to all of those put together. Paintings, rather, that were created in response to the kind of the space, as well as the sort of workings of the idea of a collage, the idea of a community. There were some smaller, you know, sort of paintings that I just wanted to show you in terms of how they're constructed, because I guess it becomes less about trying to paint a painting. It's become so much more about trying to make a painting, and in almost, you know, sort of trying to kind of pull the aspect of assemblage more so than just the aspect of kind of trying to materially express the gesture, if you like. Where next? Very good question. I think one of the things that, for me, my PhDs allowed me to do is to very sort of concretely and very, you know, kind of consciously be able to sort of think through practice as something that is perhaps the viable aspect of not just producing a painting, but kind of living through a process of researching as well as thinking through painting. So it's almost like trying to connect the kind of very much a physical process of the studio practice with something that's very much a kind of thinking process in relationship to how the, where does the painting, contemporary painting stand today? And almost trying to kind of avoid certain sort of shortcomings in relationship to stylism, stylistic decisions and mannerisms of one particular language, but kind of take on board as many languages that are sort of historically represented and sort of historically kind of familiar to us, in order to make a sort of a singular representation. Again, that confidence that my research, it's almost like 10 years ago I would have never have dared to show a bare linen with a cutout that comes from a completely different painting assembled into one image. So that sort of idea of being able to kind of think through the practice, think through the theories at hand as well, has kind of given me the ability to sort of just be as experimental and as cheeky, if you like, in relationship how a painting should hold and how a painting should sit. What also became very important, I guess, in relationship to how I was observing this idea of an image in terms of its community, was its relationship to spectatorship. Because I almost felt the spectatorship was lost in relationship to how the history of, if you like, modernist painting was written about, that almost it became insufficient to now actually even have a spectator, especially if you take into consideration the kind of the information-led, communicational kind of channels of making image, of making paintings, such as, for instance, through Wade Guyton's or Stephen Preener's work. So I kind of felt that, this idea of how the spectatorship sits in relationship to painting was very unsettled with me. And I think in some ways that still becomes a kind of something that I'm very much enthralled in thinking about now, that spectatorship actually doesn't become the hierarchical one of that, you're being performed to, and do you observe something that's being performed to you, but almost also looking at some ways of creating a space within a painting itself, referring again to sort of that kind of amalgamated communitarian kind of dialogue-based approach that almost opens up to that solidarity of image, that opens out to kind of things that perhaps that definitely have connection with one another, but those connections are not necessarily strictly something that we may quite so easily understand in terms of how we thematize painting. So in some ways I'm kind of still thinking through a spectatorship as something that perhaps is a sort of very much a platform to almost opening out a dialogue and a communication that is not strictly based on just what one perceives, but almost like as a sort of radical approach to painting the image that assumes a political, social, historical references. And finally, how it is that we feel as sort of the body, the expressiveness of it fits within the nature of the kind of world that we live in, that is ever so increasingly becoming removed from the physical world itself. So I'll just stop it there.